They told me that faith fails when the body fails. But in that moment, when everything stopped, I discovered it was exactly the opposite. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. There were no lights, no music, no comforting words. There was silence. An absolute, heavy, definitive silence. And in that silence, something inside me understood that I had crossed a boundary from which there is no return by human strength. I died, not as a theological concept, but as a real, concrete experience, irreversible to the natural eye. And what God revealed in that place changed my faith forever. For years I preached about power, healing, and authority. I saw bodies restored, diseases flee, impossible situations bend before faith. Yet there was a part of my belief that remained theoretical. I spoke of heaven as a future promise, as solace for the weary, as the final destination. But in that instant, when the body ceased to respond and consciousness remained, everything I thought I knew was confronted. There was no emotion. There was no fear. Just a clear realization that the reality I called life was limited, and that something infinitely more real was now before me. The first shock wasn't seeing something new. It was realizing how much of what I believed was incomplete. Heaven didn't present itself as a sentimental refuge, but as a dimension of order. There was no hurry, but neither was there passivity. Everything functioned with purpose. Everything had weight. Everything obeyed a structure that didn't depend on feelings. And there I understood something I had never learned in pulpits. The faith that works in heaven is not based on need, but on alignment. While my consciousness remained awake, it became clear that nothing in that environment reacted to despair. There was no room for pleading. There was no trying. There was no improvisation. Spiritual reality operated with a precision that exposed how much, on earth, we confuse faith with emotional insistence. There, no one tried to convince God of anything. Everything flowed from something already established. And this realization began to dismantle the way I had learned to believe. I realized that many of my prayers, though sincere, were shaped by human limitation. I asked for what had already been granted. I pleaded for what was already established. And, in that meaningful silence, I understood that heaven doesn't respond to lack. It responds to agreement. This revelation didn't come as an audible phrase, but as a profound understanding, impossible to ignore. True faith doesn't try to access heaven. It operates from within it. It was then that something even more disturbing became clear. Much of what we call humility on earth doesn't exist in that place, not because heaven is arrogant, but because identity there is resolved. No one questions whether they are accepted. No one tries to prove their worth. No one negotiates position. Everything works from a silent certainty of belonging and authority. And for the first time, I saw how much spiritual insecurity weakens the faith of those still in the body. When the realization began to return, there was a conviction in me that hadn't existed before. If the faith I practiced didn't reflect the reality of heaven, it needed adjusting, not improving. Adjusting. Because heaven doesn't adapt to earth. It's the earth that must align with heaven. And while many imagine heaven as a distant place, I understood that it's a standard, a model, an absolute reference for faith that truly works. Upon returning, nothing seemed the same. The words were the same. The scriptures were the same. But the understanding had changed. I could no longer treat faith as future hope or as an emergency tool. What was revealed to me at that boundary between life and death demanded a complete transformation. Not only in what I believed, but in how I believed. Because after touching that reality, it became impossible to continue living a faith that heaven doesn't recognize, and that's how everything began to change. What struck me most about that revelation wasn't the beauty, nor the peace, nor the absence of pain. It was the order. Everything in heaven functioned according to an absolute, stable, unquestionable spiritual logic. There was no improvisation. There was no urgency. There was no anxiety. Heaven didn't react to problems because nothing there was out of control. This directly confronted how many of us have learned to see faith as a human attempt to move God. In heaven, it became clear that God is not moved. He governs. A message for your life. If you struggle daily with the challenges of type 1 or type 2 diabetes, you know how exhausting this condition can be, physically, emotionally, and even financially. Blood sugar spikes, constant fears of complications, and the feeling of being trapped by medication and restrictions. It's like living on a never-ending roller coaster, isn't it? Now imagine something different, a path that can help you control your diabetes, or even reverse the symptoms in the case of type 2. Sounds impossible? Well, there's a video that will show you exactly how this is possible. It's not magic, but knowledge that can change your life. Stop everything now. Your health, your well-being, and your future deserve this. Click the link in the first comment and watch the video that will change your life. Watch it to the end and discover how to take the next step towards a life without limitations. Control is within your reach. Link in the first comment to watch the video. The first great revelation was this: heaven doesn't operate through emotion, it operates through authority. Nothing there responded to despair, need, or effort. Spiritual reality didn't bow to tears, but to alignment. And this exposed something uncomfortable. Much of the faith practiced on earth is emotionally intense, but spiritually misaligned. In heaven, there is no faith based on need. There is faith based on position. I realized that everything in that environment flowed from something already established. There were no requests in the human sense of the word. There was agreement. There was execution. There was a silent clarity that everything that happened was under a perfectly defined government. Heaven doesn't debate decisions. It manifests decrees. And that completely changed my understanding of prayer, authority, and relationship with God. On earth, we often pray as if God needs to be convinced, informed, or sensitized. In heaven, that doesn't exist. Not because God is distant, but because His will is already established. It became evident there that true faith doesn't try to generate something new. It enters into agreement with what has already been determined. This was one of the most confronting truths I received, because it reveals that the problem is not a lack of power, but a lack of alignment. Another profound revelation was understanding that heaven is an environment of conscious government. Every movement, every action, every spiritual manifestation happens within a structure of authority. Nothing is chaotic. Nothing is accidental. Everything obeys a clear hierarchy. And suddenly, it made sense why so many prayers made on earth are sincere but ineffective. They don't fail for lack of faith. They fail for lack of understanding of the spiritual order. In heaven, no one tries to assume a position that doesn't belong to them. But neither does anyone live below the position they've been given. This is fundamental. Authority there isn't earned through effort, but exercised through identity. And this perception exposed a common error in modern faith. We confuse humility with spiritual insecurity. In heaven, humility isn't about diminishing oneself. It's about remaining perfectly aligned with what God has established. It also became clear that heaven doesn't respond to empty words, but to words that carry truth and agreement. There was no excessive language, no repetition. Everything was simple, precise, sufficient. This revealed how much, on earth, we use words to try to compensate for a lack of conviction. We pray a lot, we talk a lot, we repeat a lot, because deep down, we are still not fully convinced of what we declare. What God revealed about heaven was, in fact, an uncomfortable mirror for earth. It showed that the faith that truly works isn't born from the fear of losing, but from the certainty of belonging. It isn't born from urgency, but from trust. It isn't born from doubt, but from clarity. And at that moment I understood that heaven is not just a future destination. It is the absolute reference point of true faith. This revelation began to dismantle the childish image of heaven as merely a place of eternal rest. Heaven is a center of spiritual governance, an environment where God's will is not debated, but manifested, where there is no distance between intention and action, where authority flows naturally because everyone knows who they are, where they are, and to whom they belong. Upon understanding this, something became inevitable. If the faith practiced on earth does not reflect the reality of heaven, then it needs to be transformed. Not superficially adjusted, but realigned in its essence. Because praying in a way that heaven does not recognize is living a faith disconnected from the source that sustains it. And it was at this point that the question became impossible to avoid. How has the church distanced itself so much from this reality? How has the faith that should reflect heaven become so dependent on emotion, effort, and trial and error? The answer to this began to reveal itself, and it would require a direct confrontation with the errors that had become normalized over time. That is precisely what we need to face next. The distance between faith that reflects heaven and faith practiced on earth didn't appear overnight. It was built slowly, almost imperceptibly, as good intentions replaced understanding and emotion took the place of revelation. The church's mistake wasn't abandoning faith but redefining it. Without realizing it, we exchanged authority for effort, position for performance, and alignment for insistence. And the result was a sincere but weakened faith. The first great error was transforming faith into trying. We began to believe as those who hope to convince God, when in reality we should believe as those who agree with Him. Biblical faith was never a desperate plea for intervention. It was always a response to something that had already been established. However, over time, the church began to measure spirituality by emotional intensity, not by clarity of alignment. We cry more, shout more, repeat more, and understand less. Another profound error was the disconnection between heaven and earth. Faith ceased to be a reflection of celestial reality and began to be shaped by human limitations. Instead of asking, "How does this work in heaven?" we started asking, "What works for me right now?" This inversion is subtle, but devastating. When faith is built on human need, it will always be unstable. When it is built on the reality of heaven, it remains firm, even when circumstances don't immediately change. The church also began to confuse humility with a lack of authority. We were taught that acknowledging our weakness meant constantly talking about it. But in heaven, weakness isn't proclaimed, it's resolved. True humility isn't denying what God has granted, but remaining faithful to the position He has established. When the church lost this understanding, it began to present itself before God as an insecure servant, not as a aligned daughter. This directly affected how we pray, believe, and live. There is also an error that few realize: the substitution of identity for performance. Instead of living from who we are, we started trying to become worthy through what we do. This mentality produced a tired, anxious faith, always trying to compensate for something. But in heaven, identity is never earned, it is recognized. When this truth was lost, faith began to fluctuate according to behavior, not according to spiritual position. This distancing also explains why so many believers know the scriptures but do not experience their effectiveness. The words ceased to be a living reality and became merely correct content. Verses are quoted, but not lived. Declarations are made, but not sustained by conviction. The problem is not in the biblical text, but in the conscience of the one who uses it. Without alignment with the reality of heaven, even the most powerful truth becomes inoperative. Another critical point was the normalization of doubt. Instead of treating it as a sign of misalignment, we began to accept it as a natural part of faith. But in heaven, doubt does not govern decisions. Heavenly faith is marked by clarity, not confusion. When the church began to tolerate uncertainty as something healthy, it opened space for a fragmented faith, incapable of sustaining consistent spiritual authority. This series of errors produced a generation of believers who love God but do not fully trust the position they have received. People who believe in heaven but do not live from it, who await eternity but ignore the standard it establishes now. Faith has lost its governing function and has become merely a comforting hope. And although this brings comfort, it does not produce transformation. That is exactly what that revelation exposed so clearly. The problem was never the absence of divine power. The problem was the misalignment of human faith with heavenly reality. The church did not lose God, it lost its reference point. And until that reference point is restored, faith will remain sincere but limited. However, this realization did not come to condemn, but to correct. Because when the error is identified, restoration becomes possible. And when faith realigns with heaven, something powerful begins to happen, not only in the way of believing, but in the way of living. This is what needs to be understood next. What changes when faith returns to its original place? When faith realigns with the reality of heaven, the first change doesn't happen outwardly, but inwardly. The way of thinking adjusts before circumstances even move. There's a silent yet profound transition where faith ceases to be an anxious attempt and becomes a firm stance. It's no longer about seeing if God will act, but about understanding how to act in accordance with what He has already established. This alignment completely changes the believer's spiritual posture. Prayer is one of the first areas to be transformed. It ceases to be a prolonged effort to obtain divine attention and becomes a conscious act of agreement. Instead of long explanations, clear declarations emerge. Instead of emotional insistence, there is quiet conviction. Not because the problem is small, but because the spiritual position is now greater than the problem. Faith aligned with heaven doesn't try to create authority. It operates from it. This change also redefines the relationship with time. Anxiety diminishes because faith ceases to be governed by urgency. In heaven, everything happens at the right time, and this perception begins to influence how one lives on earth. Haste gives way to confidence. Restlessness yields to stability. This is not about passivity, but about security. Faith aligned with heaven doesn't chase results. It walks with direction. Another evident transformation occurs in how one deals with opposition. When faith is still emotional, any resistance seems like a sign of failure. But when it is aligned with heaven, resistance is interpreted as part of the process, not as a denial of truth. The believer stops reacting impulsively to circumstances and begins to respond from an established position. This brings firmness, constancy, and authority. Spiritual identity is also strengthened. The constant need for validation disappears because acceptance is already resolved. When faith aligns with heaven, the believer doesn't need to prove anything. They simply remain. This inner stability generates a confidence that doesn't depend on applause, immediate results, or external recognition. Faith is lived from the inside out, not built from the environment. This change even affects the way we speak. Words cease to reflect fear, doubt, or insecurity, and begin to carry direction and clarity. It's not a mechanical repetition of positive phrases, but a natural expression of conviction. Faith aligned with heaven doesn't ignore reality, but neither does it submit to it. Circumstances are acknowledged, but they don't have the final say. There's also a new perception of spiritual authority. It ceases to be something reserved for special moments or specific leaders and becomes understood as part of daily life. Faith aligned with heaven understands that authority is not something that is activated occasionally, but something that is exercised consciously. This generates consistency. The believer stops experiencing spiritual highs and lows and begins to walk with stability. Another important point is the relationship with the enemy. When faith is emotional, fear occupies excessive space. But when it aligns with heaven, fear loses its power. The enemy ceases to be seen as a constant threat and begins to be recognized as someone who operates only where there is confusion and misalignment. Faith aligned with heaven doesn't live in a state of permanent alert, but in a state of spiritual awareness. This transformation also produces maturity. Faith ceases to be reactive and becomes proactive. Instead of responding only when something goes wrong, the believer begins to live consciously, aligning thoughts, words, and decisions with heavenly reality. This generates consistent fruits, not just isolated experiences. Spiritual life ceases to be a succession of crises and becomes a continuous journey. Finally, perhaps the most significant change is this. Faith ceases to be something one tries to use and becomes something one lives. It is no longer a tool for emergencies, but a permanent position. When faith aligns with heaven, the believer understands that they were not called only to wait for eternity, but to reflect on their reality now. This understanding doesn't make life free of challenges, but completely redefines how to face them. Faith aligned with heaven doesn't ask if God is present. It lives knowing that He is, and this certainty changes everything. It is from this place that the final calling arises, a faith that heaven recognizes, sustains, and confirms. Reaching this point requires spiritual honesty. After all that has been revealed, it becomes impossible to continue living the faith in the same way. Not because someone forces it, but because the conscience has already been touched. A faith that heaven recognizes is not defined by emotional intensity, but by continuous alignment. It is not born from extreme moments, but from a daily decision to live from the correct spiritual reality, and this decision always demands a response. The greatest call of this revelation is not to do more, but to change position. Many try to improve their faith, when what needs to happen is a complete repositioning. It's not about adding new practices, but about abandoning old mentalities. The faith that heaven recognizes does not beg for acceptance, because it already lives from it. It does not fight for authority, because it operates consciously from the position it has received. It does not negotiate with doubt, nor does it coexist with insecurity as if they were spiritual virtues. This call directly confronts comfortable faith, the kind that is content to believe without assuming spiritual responsibility. Because aligning oneself with heaven implies living consciously. Thoughts begin to be filtered. Words are chosen with care. Decisions cease to be impulsive reactions and become expressions of conviction. Faith ceases to be something reserved for difficult times and begins to govern daily life. A faith that heaven recognizes also abandons the habit of over-explaining. It doesn't need to justify its trust nor convince others of its validity. It sustains itself because it is rooted in something greater than circumstances. This faith doesn't show off, but it also doesn't hide. It simply remains firm, even when there are no applause, immediate answers, or visible signs. This is the point where many retreat, not for lack of love for God, but for fear of abandoning old patterns. It's more comfortable to live trying than to live taking a stand. Trying allows for excuses. Taking a stand demands responsibility. But heaven doesn't respond to attempts. It recognizes alignment. And this truth needs to be faced with maturity. The invitation here is not for a momentary experience, but for a practical change of identity. It is deciding to live as someone who not only believes in heaven, but reflects its reality. Someone who understands that faith is not a tool for obtaining favors, but a way of existing. This decision is not manifested only in grand declarations, but in small daily choices: how you think, how you speak, how you react, how you expect. A faith aligned with heaven also learns to silence noise. External opinions lose power. Emotional pressures cease to govern decisions. The reference point ceases to be the environment and becomes spiritual reality. This does not isolate the believer from the world, but stabilizes them within it. They do not live above reality, but are not dominated by it. This final call is not aggressive, but firm. It does not condemn the past, but demands clarity for the future. What has been lived so far may have been sincere, but now there is a greater revelation. And every revelation carries responsibility. To ignore it is to choose to remain limited. To respond to it is to allow faith to mature. Therefore, the invitation is simple, but profound. Align yourself. Not just in words, but in consciousness. Recognize that heaven is not just a destination, but a standard. That faith is not just hope, but a stance. That living spiritually is not reacting to what happens, but responding from who you are. If this truth has found space within you, don't let it remain just information. Transform it into agreement. Declare it consciously. Write it as an act of decision, not emotion. I choose to align my faith with the reality of heaven, not as a ritual, but as a stance. Because when faith aligns, heaven recognizes. And when heaven recognizes, life is never the same again. This is the end of this message, and the beginning of a faith that finally reflects where it came from.